Kelly Trimble, Persuasive Speech. Newspapers called Dax Cowart the man who was sentenced to life. Dax Cowart was 25 years old when a pipeline exploded, killing his father and severely burning nearly his entire body. When he arrived at the hospital, his fingers were amputated, his right eye was removed, and his left eye was sewn shut. According to Christine Wicker, for 14 months, nurses dunked him in Clorox and scrubbed his burnt skin. They then took him back to bed, where he would scream and beg, "Please just let me die. Please just let me die." Dax is 41 years old now and still claims that death would have been the better option. Dax quotes, "To say that my life now justifies the treatment forced upon me is to say that the end justifies the means, something he will never say. I believe that euthanasia should be a legalized option for those who are terminally ill or in unendurable pain so they can experience a relatively painless death free of suffering." Euthanasia provides an easier death and relieves suffering. A doctor can provide and administer medication to quickly end the life of an individual who wishes to do so. There are two different categories that euthanasia can fall into, according to Euthanasia by Sunny Bloyd. Passive euthanasia is when you take someone who is on life support off of it and wait for them to die naturally, or when they decide not to put the patient on life support at all. Active euthanasia is when a doctor gives a patient a prescription for a death-causing drug. The doctor can either administer the drug with a lethal injection or instruct the patient on how to use it, and they can decide when and where they want to die. Euthanasia can be voluntary, non-voluntary, and involuntary, according to James Feaser from the University of Tennessee at Martin. Voluntary is when the individual chooses life or death for themselves. Non-voluntary is when the patient is unable to make their own decision, so a third party member makes the decision for them. And involuntary is when death is imposed on a patient against his or her will, which is much different from non-voluntary and should continue to be illegal. James Feaser states in his article that there are three situations in which an individual should be able to be legally euthanized. 1, if the patient is terminally ill. 2, if the patient is in intense pain. And 3, if the patient voluntarily chooses to end his life to escape prolonged suffering. According to opposing viewpoints, the opposition believes that life is always sacred, no matter the circumstance. Some people believe that suffering can be dignifying to the spirit, and I think that those who believe that can endure the suffering, but that doesn't mean that those who don't should have to as well. Euthanasia supporters believe that human life only holds meaning if living without unendurable pain and mental suffering. If it is legal for someone to refuse treatment and let themselves die, then why is it so wrong for someone to want to speed up the process and ease the pain of their inevitable death? Statistics have shown that the patient's primary concern is not the pain that they are in, but their loss of autonomy or freedom to choose. Suffering patients want the freedom to choose their own fate, even more than they want to end their suffering. These pie charts show the concerns of patients who chose to end their lives in Oregon, a state that has legalized euthanasia. As you can see in the top left, 84% feared losing autonomy. 84% were also concerned about decreasing ability to take part in enjoyable activities, and 47% were concerned about losing control of their bodily functions. According to Sunny Bloyd's book, Euthanasia, in the situation of an unconscious loved one, family members often do not know what the patient would truly want. I encourage you to ask those close to you what they would want in that situation. Hospitals have the ability to take over functions of nearly every vital organ. Life support systems can regulate breathing, maintain a heartbeat, deliver nourishment, and filter waste. They can be extremely helpful, but in a situation of inevitable death, they're simply prolonging the dying process. Medical advances are booming and have the ability to save a lot of lives, but according to The Moral Issue by Robert Baird, we must draw the line between extending life and prolonging death. Right now, there are over 10,000 people living in nursing homes on a feeding tube, unconscious. Keeping them on the feeding tube, they could live up to 30 more years. If they were taken off, they would die within 10 days. Feeding tubes keep people artificially alive. The question is, if technology is the only thing keeping someone alive, are they still truly living? I would say no. According to Gerard Dworkin's book, Euthanasia and Physician-Assisted Suicide, the opposition thinks that euthanasia violates the medical code that, according to the Hippocratic Oath, doctors cannot kill. But, according to Charles Barron, professor of law at Boston College, healthcare professionals still admit to engaging in this activity anyways, when they feel the situation requires it. A national survey about euthanasia in the United States that appeared in the England Journal of Medicine showed that 11% of doctors, a total of 1,902 doctors, said that under certain circumstances they would accelerate a person's death by prescribing medication. 7% said they would provide a lethal injection. So if doctors are already doing it, why is it so wrong? The answer is, it's not. As reflected in 3 recent national surveys, when asked if euthanasia should be administered for a patient with an incurable disease, 53% of the nation said yes, and 39% said no. For patients suffering great pain with no hope of improvement, 60% said yes, and 34% said no. And for patients who simply believe they are just a heavy burden on his or her family, 29% said yes, and 62% said no. I believe that euthanasia should be an option, not the only option. If someone still has quality of life, then yes, euthanasia is wrong. But if someone has no quality of life, has lost the ability to be mentally present, and is sentenced to a life of pain and suffering, then yes, euthanasia is the best option. Being euthanized means ending your life in a painless and dignified manner. It means quick relief from suffering, and it requires the consent of the patient or the family in the case of unconsciousness. It means an easier death for one who is dying, and a feeling of comfort for the family, knowing that their loved one will die in peace. In cases of those like Dax Calvert, when dying is the request of the patient, why force a person to live? It is only they who know the pain that they are going through and decide.